Hello everybody, welcome to jurycentral.com online classes for law exam. So today I will be dealing with you the rest of the subjective questions of Jamia Millia Islamia LLM entrance examination of the year 2018. Yesterday I have dealt with you a total number of 5 questions, and today I will be dealing with you from question number 6 to 10. So before starting this session, I would request all of you to kindly like, share, subscribe to the channel. Those of you who have missed the first part, I would be sharing the link in the comment section below and also in the description box. So let us start. So I will be going a little fast today because I have to cover all the 4 answers and the answers are a bit lengthy. I hope all of you know the rules of answering these questions. You will be having 10 questions in the subjective part. Out of the 10 questions, you have to answer only 6 questions, and each will be carrying equal marks, that is 10 marks each, and the total marks awarded for subjective part is 60. And also people, if you want to qualify the LLM entrance examination, then you need to qualify at least 30% in the subjective part. So let us start. Question number 6. Define unpaid seller. What are rights of unpaid seller refer to relevant statutory provisions. So in certain cases, when a buyer refuses or fails to pay the requisite amount to the seller becomes an unpaid seller and can exercise certain rights against the buyer. These rights are considered as seller's remedy in case there is breach of contract by the buyer. These remedies can be against the buyer and also against the goods. According to section 45 clause 1 of the Sales of Goods Act, the seller is considered as an unpaid seller when the whole price hasn't been paid and the seller has an immediate right of action for the price, when bills of exchange or other negotiable instrument has been received as conditional payment and the prerequisite condition hasn't been fulfilled by reason of the dishonor of the instrument or otherwise. Then seller also includes a person who is in a position of a seller, that is agent consignor, who had himself paid or is responsible for the price. Then rights against the buyer. So the first right is suit for the price, and it has been given under section 55 clause 1, which says when any goods are passed on to the buyer and the buyer has wrongfully neglected or refused to pay as per the terms and conditions of the contract, the seller may sue him as per section 55 clause 1, because once the property has been passed, the buyer is bound to pay the price. So it happens only when the property in the goods has been passed to the buyer. Then remedy number 2, suit for damages. In case there is wrongful refusal on the part of buyer for acceptance of goods and payment of money, the seller can sue him for damages for non-acceptance as per section 56. The relevant case law is M. Lachia Shetty versus Coffee Board. Then point number 3, suit for interest, as stated under section 61, where there is a specific agreement between buyer and seller with regards to interest or special damages on the price of goods from the date on which the payment becomes due, the seller may recover interest from the buyer. Fourth one is repudiation of the contract before the due date. It has been given under section 60. The rule of anticipatory breach of contract applies, wherein if buyer repudiates the contract before the date of delivery, the seller can consider the contract as rescinded and can sue for damages of the breach. Then rights against goods. We have dealt with right against buyer, and then we are dealing with rights against goods. So first one is lien, very important. Lien is a right which seller of goods can exercise when a buyer hasn't paid the price of goods. Under this right, seller can retain the possession of goods as an agent or bailiff for the buyer. The seller can retain his possession as per section 47 under the following circumstances. What are the cases? In case the buyer is insolvent, when the term of goods sold on credit is expired. Third, goods sold without any stipulation as to credit. So these are the conditions under which the seller can retain his possession or can exercise his lien under section 47. Then section 48, if the seller has delivered a part of unpaid goods, he can exercise his right of lien on rest. Then termination of lien, when it takes place, as per section 49, under following circumstances, right of lien is terminated: when it is a waiver of lien, then when buyer or agent lawfully obtains possession of goods, and when the seller delivered goods to a courier or other bailiff for the purpose of transmission to the buyer without reserving the right of disposal to the goods. Then stoppage, when the goods have been transferred to courier or bailiff for the purpose of transmission to the buyer who has become insolvent, the seller has the right to stop the goods in transit in order to protect himself against the loss that may arise due to insolvency. And as per section 50, there are 4 essential requirements for stopping the goods in transit. What are these? So first one is unpaid seller. In case if the buyer goes insolvent, then property should have passed to the buyer, and then property should be in course of transit. So only in such cases the seller has the right to exercise his right of stoppage. Section 51 lays down the rules and regulations related to commencement and end of the transit. The section is divided into 7 subsections. First one is delivery to the buyer. The relevant case law is James versus Griffin. So rest of the other paras you can read by pausing this video. Then interception by the buyer. If the buyer has intercepted, the case law is Lyons versus Hon Fung. Then third is acknowledgement to the buyer. Case law is Whitehead versus Anderson. Fourth one is rejection by the buyer. Then fifth one is delivery to ship chartered by the buyer. Sixth one is wrongful refusal to delivery, and seventh one is part delivery. And for wrongful refusal of delivery, the relevant case law is Bird versus Brown. And for part delivery, let us read it first. In the case when the goods have been delivered partly, the seller has a right to stop the delivery of the rest of the goods unless the part delivery shows an agreement to the possession of the whole. So under these circumstances, the seller has a right of stoppage in transit. So we have already read all the 7 conditions. Then see the next right available is resale. Exercising the right of lien or stoppage doesn't receive the agreement, but reselling of goods does, and without this right the other 2 rights of lien or stoppage would not be of much usage, because he can only return goods under this right till the buyer pays back the money. So according to this para, resale is more effective than right of lien or stoppage because it actually rescinds the agreement. Seller before reselling the goods needs to send a notice to the buyer except in the case of perishable goods, giving him last chance to pay the price and take back the goods within a reasonable time. If the buyer doesn't pay the money back, seller has a right to resell the goods. If the seller fails to give notice of his intention to resell, he cannot claim damages from the buyer and he has to give any profit. So it is mandatory that before reselling, the seller must give a notice to the buyer. Then we come to the conclusion part. The seller becomes an unpaid seller when either he had not been paid in full, or the buyer has failed to meet the maturity of bills of exchange or any other negotiable instrument accepted by seller as condition precedent. Under this situation, the seller can resell the goods if it had exercised the right of lien or stoppage in transit after giving notice to the buyer, and the new buyer will have a good title over the goods. Then question number 7, who can be the Karta of the joint Hindu family? Explain the powers of the Karta. Can female become Karta of the joint Hindu family in light of recent judgment? So let us read. First we will start with the introduction. So let me tell you one very thing clearly. So I am also mentioning the provisions in the answer. So you need to remember that you have to mention the relevant provisions and also the relevant case laws along with it. The eldest adult co-partner, head of the family of a Hindu undivided family, is known as, and also I would like to tell you, like, you do not have to copy as it is what I am reading over to you, but you have to cut short the answer and have to write in your own words. The eldest adult co-partner, head of the family of an HUF, that is Hindu undivided family, is known as the Karta, who is responsible for handling the affairs of the family. He is entrusted with the powers of managing all assets and other financial matters. All securities of a Hindu undivided family typically in the name of the Karta. There is no prescribed formal procedure for appointment of the Karta in an Hindu undivided family. So on the death of the Karta, the next senior most member automatically becomes the new Karta of the Hindu undivided family, but at times statutory authorities may require a declaration from the members forming part of the HUF declaring the eldest co-partner as the new Karta of the HUF. So it is actually understood that the eldest member of the family actually works as Karta. Then second, if Karta passes away, can his wife or daughter become a Karta? Is it also possible for a wife to be a Karta if she has a son who is above 18 years of age? So on the demise of a male Karta, it is not possible for a daughter to become a Karta of the Hindu undivided family under the circumstances where she is the eldest adult co-partner in the family. The courts have found no restrictions in the law preventing the eldest female co-partner of an HUF from being its karta. So earlier it was not the rule, but now after this judgment, after a latest judgment of the Delhi High Court, now woman can also act as karta, and she has to be the eldest daughter, or say the eldest adult co-partner in the family. However, in case of wife of the deceased karta, the same argument cannot be extended, since the wife of the deceased karta is never treated as a co-partner to the HUF. So, a wife of the deceased karta, that means a widow, is not treated as a co-partner of the family, but a widow therefore cannot act as karta of the HUF after the death of her husband. Interestingly, in cases where surviving male co-partners were minors, the courts took a view that widow can be a manager of the HUF while distinguishing the position of a manager from that of a karta. Thus, it would be correct to say that as of today, if a woman who is not a co-partner, widow or wife of a co-partner has a son above the age of 18 years, in such case it is not possible for her to be a karta to the Hindu undivided family. Then we will be studying about the landmark case of the Delhi High Court, in which it has been held that the eldest female member of the family can also become a karta in Hindu undivided family. In February 2016, Delhi High Court, in a landmark verdict, Sujata Sharma versus Manu Gupta, clarified and gave a broader interpretation to Section 6 of the Hindu Succession Act. It was argued that the 2005 amendment to the Hindu Succession Act only recognized the rights of a female member to inheritance and doesn't address the issue of management of the HUF estate. The court found the language of amended Section 6 to be clear in extending equal rights to women in terms of both inheritance and management of the estate. It thereby clarified and expanded the ambit of the amendment to Section 6 in finding no reason to deny Hindu women co-partner the position of karta. So the question is actually based on the landmark judgment Sujata Sharma versus Manu Gupta. So you need to mention this case law because the question is based on it. Does a karta has absolute rights over assets of the family? Now we will read. A karta has absolute power to manage the family property, and as such this power cannot be challenged in court. However, the dissatisfied co-partner is always free to demand partition of family property at any point of time. As far as the power of alienation is concerned, as per Mitakshara law and ruling of various courts, the karta requires consent of all the other co-partners for alienation of the family property unless. So, first of all, a karta has absolute power to manage the family property, and also a dissatisfied co-partner is always at his liberty to take legal recourse and also to take a demand for the partition. But there are certain circumstances in which the karta can also dispose of the property. We will be reading the conditions now. There is a legal necessity. This has been decided in case of Dev Kishan versus Ram Kishan, and it is for the benefit of the state. This Bal Mukund versus Kamalavati. The karta may also alienate property without consent of the co-partner for performance of indispensable duties. A decision taken by the karta in these special circumstances cannot be normally be challenged in the court. So, if under this condition a karta disposes his family or alienates his disposes his property or alienates his property, so such decisions are not actually can be challengeable in court. However, where such a challenge is brought before the court, the burden of proof will lie on the karta to prove that there was in fact presence of legal necessity, benefit of state, or indispensable duties. So these are the conditions for the that the karta can exercise his absolute power over the management of the property, that is legal necessity, benefit of estate, or indispensable duties. Then what are the role, duties, moral responsibilities and powers of a karta? The karta plays a fiduciary role in the Hindu undivided family as he is entrusted with the management of family property and the general welfare of the family. By virtue of being the senior most member of the family, the karta is in addition morally responsible to act in a bona fide manner in the best interest of the business and the family as a whole. The karta has the power to manage a joint family business, which involves the power to contract debt for family purposes. Then he can also enter into contracts, refer matters to arbitration, enter into compromises, alienate joint family property, acknowledge debts, and represent the business issues. So these are the duties and the powers of the karta. which actually involves the power to contract debt or family purposes, enter into contracts or refer any matter to arbitration, or he may also enter into compromises or alienate joint family property or acknowledge debts and represent the business in suits. Concurrent to this power is a duty to render accounts, release debts due to the family, operate in a reasonable and judicial manner, and take the consent of other co-partners in making important decisions of such as starting a new business or alienating co-partnership property. Then we'll come to conclusion. The twofold advantage of an HUF is its easy setup and tax benefits. The membership to an HUF is by birth and there is no prescribed limit on the maximum number of members of an HUF. Since an HUF is a separate legal entity, it is entitled to have its own PAN card and hence can enjoy tax savings and claim various tax rebates and deductions for an HUF account under Section 80C, 88 and 80L of the Income Tax Act. So even HUF can also enjoy tax benefits under the following sections of Income Tax Act. Further, an HUF can provide loans to co-partners and members to the HUF for various purposes and can also make payments in respect of life insurance policy for any of the members of the HUF. Then question number 8, state the grounds on which a Muslim wife can seek dissolution of her marriage under the provisions of the Dissolution of her Marriage under the provisions of the Dissolution of Muslim Marriage Act 1939. So similar kind of question was also asked in the year 2018. I have made a detailed video of the full questions descriptive part of LLM entrance examination 2018. I have already uploaded the video. I would share the link in the description box below. You can check the same. First we'll start with the introduction. Firm union of the husband and wife is a necessary condition for a happy family. Islam therefore insists upon the subsistence of a marriage and prescribes that breach of marriage contract should be avoided. Initially, no marriage is contracted to be dissolved, but in unfortunate circumstances, the matrimonial contract is broken. One of the ways of such dissolution is by way of divorce. Under Muslim law, the divorce may take place by the act of the parties themselves or by a decree of the court of law. However, in whatever manner the divorce is effected, it has not been regarded as a rule of life. In Islam, divorce is considered as an exception to the status of marriage. That means even divorce is considered as an evil in Islam, and it is accepted as an exception to the status of marriage. Then Dissolution of Muslim Marriage Act 1939, we will read a brief about this act. Qazi Muhammad Ahmad Kazmi had introduced a bill in the legislature regarding the issue on 17th April 1936. It, however, became law on 17th March 1939 and thus stood the Dissolution of Muslim Marriages Act 1939. So let me tell you, you do not have to write your answer of each and every word what I am giving in the form of answers. So you have to write the points in your own words and you have to limit the same in 500 words. Section 2 of the Act runs thereunder, a woman married under Muslim law shall be entitled to obtain a decree for divorce for the dissolution of her marriage on any one or more of the following grounds, namely. So the first ground is, so there are total number of 8 grounds given to a Muslim woman under Dissolution of Muslim Marriages Act 1939. That is, the whereabouts of the husband have not been known for a period of 4 years. This means if the husband is missing for a period of 4 years, the wife may file a petition for the dissolution of her marriage. The husband is deemed to be missing if the wife or any such person who is expecting to have the knowledge of the husband is unable to locate the husband. So you can read the rest of the para by pausing this video. So then the next ground is that the husband has neglected or has failed to provide for her maintenance for a period of 2 years. It's a legal obligation of every husband to maintain his wife, and if he fails to do so, the wife may seek divorce on this ground. And then third one is that the husband has been sentenced to imprisonment for a period of 7 years or upwards. The wife's right of judicial divorce on this ground begins from the date on which the sentence becomes final. So therefore, the decree can be passed in her favor only after the expiry of the date of appeal by the husband or after the appeal by the husband has been dismissed by the final. So suppose if the husband has filed any appeal challenging the decision of the court, then the wife cannot present a petition for divorce during that period. Then point number 4, that the husband has failed to perform without reasonable cause his marital obligations for a period of 3 years. So what does it mean, marital obligation? Let us read. The Act doesn't define marital obligations of the husband. There are several marital obligations of the husband under Muslim law, but for the purpose of this clause, husband's failure to perform only those conjugal obligations may be taken into account which are not included in any of the clauses of this section 2 of this Act. Then fifth, that the husband was important at the time of marriage and continues to do so. The relevant case law is Gul Muhammad Khan versus Hasina. Sixth one is if the husband has been insane for a period of 2 years or is suffering from leprosy or virulent venereal disease. Then seventh one is that she having been given in marriage by her father or other guardian before she attained the age of 15 years. So this is actually known as optional puberty, in which the woman can seek for divorce after attaining the age of 15 years, where she can claim that she has been given in marriage by her father and guardian, and the divorce can be granted only in cases where the marriage hasn't been consummated. Then seventh one, that the husband treats her with cruelty, that is to say, very very important point, habitual assaults her or makes her life miserable by cruelty of conduct, even if such conduct doesn't amount to physical ill treatment. That means it also includes mental ill treatment. Associates with women of ill repute or leads to an infamous life, or attempts to force her to lead an immoral life, or disposes of her property, prevents her exercising her legal rights, obstructs her in the observance of her religious freedom or practice, or if he has more than one wife, doesn't treat her equitably in accordance with the injunctions of the Holy Quran. So these are the conditions of mental cruelty. And the relevant case laws are Sayyid Ziauddin versus Parvez Sultana, Zubeda Begum versus Sardar Shah, Abu Bakr versus Mamuk Koya, and Itwari versus Asgari. So we have read all the this is eighth one. Seventh one is that she having been in marriage by her father or other guardian before she attained the age of 15 years. And eighth one is cruelty. Then we'll come to the conclusion part. These laws were piecemeal, targeting only certain aspect of the personal law. For instance, the Dissolution of Muslim Marriage Act only laid down grounds on which women can seek a divorce. It never curbed men's right to unilateral oral divorce, nor did it lay down any procedure for the recovery of marriage, post-divorce maintenance, or about the custody of children. Then all three instances of codification of certain aspects of Muslim personal law show that religious men from community use their influence on the entire process to protect the Sharia from any pro-women reform. So the conclusion is actually saying that although these rights have been given to women, but the absolute right of divorce is actually lying in the hands of man. Accordingly, all attempts at bringing about pro-women reforms and some uniformity at the Muslim law failed. So even if this law has been enacted, but it actually doesn't do justice with the women. Then question number 9, critically differentiate between the infringement of trademark and passing off. Very important question, introduction. A trademark may be defined as a lawfully protected abstract word, symbol, color, a mark, slogan, or a mixture of those related to an organization or a selected product that differentiates it from others accessible within the market. Then this is actually the trademark. Infringement. So infringement has been defined under section 29 of the Trademarks Act 1999, which says that a registered trademark is infringed by a person who, not being a registered proprietor or a person using by way of permitted use, uses in the course of trade a mark which is identical with or deceptively similar to the trademark in relation to goods or services in respect of which the trademark is registered, and in such manner as to render the use of the mark likely to be taken as being used as a trademark. So infringement actually means, suppose there's a registered trademark and the infringer is actually misusing the trademark, whether the trademark deals in goods and services, it doesn't matter. So he is actually making a non-permitted use, this is known as trademark under section 29. And passing of, what does it mean? Trademark Act 1999 doesn't have an explicit provision that specifically describes passing off, but there is a number of common law judgments that lets the court draw its meaning as to whether the infringement of trademark done is in such a way that the mark is not only deceptively similar to the trademark of that other company, but This also capable of creating or is creating confusion for the customers, which ultimately results in damage for business of the company. So passing, the definition of passing mark is actually more broader than infringement. Infringement only says that a person is misusing the registered trademark for his own use, but in passing off there is actually a loss of business by the using, by infringing the trademark. So we will see now a fundamental principle behind the thought of passing off is that a man is not to sell his goods under the pretense that they are the goods of another man. So you may have seen especially in the local markets, like there are many shops you have encountered which are selling their goods in the name of reputed brand name, in the name of a reputed company or under a reputed brand name. But the reputed brand name, the reputed brand is actually not selling these goods which he is selling, but he is actually making an impression that the goods which he is selling actually belongs from a reputed brand. So that will come under passing off. Like in the case of Cadbury India Limited and others versus Neeraj Food Products, the High Court of Delhi explained the difference between passing off action and an action for trademark infringement as under. An action for trademark infringement is a statutory remedy, and on the other hand, an action for passing off is a common law remedy. That is true. So passing off is a common law remedy. The use of the trademark of the plaintiff by the defendant is also prerequisite in the case of an action for infringement, while it is not a necessity of an action for passing off. So the use is not necessary in passing off. In an action for infringement of the plaintiff's trademark, it is immaterial that the outfit, outer covering and other written marks on the goods originate from a different source other than that of a registered proprietor's trademark. The liability of the defendant in such a case may be absolute. However, in case of passing off a trademark, the defendant may escape liability if he can show that material added by him is sufficient to distinguish his goods from that of plaintiff's goods. So there must be different of goods which is to be sold or which is actually endorsed by the defendant from that of plaintiff goods. In an action for infringement, the plaintiff, on account of it being a registered trademark in dispute, claims to have an exclusive right to use the mark concerning those goods. However, passing off by a person of his goods as those of another in essence is an action of deceit. So infringement doesn't work under the concept of deceit, but passing off actually attracts the penal provisions of deceit. Then in a recent case of S. Sayyid Mohiddin versus Sulochana Bai, the apex court of the country stated that a passing of right is a wider remedy than that of infringement. This is because the passing of doctrine operates on the general principle that no person is entitled to represent his or her business as the business of another person. The said action of deceit is maintainable for diverse reasons other than that of registered rights, which are allocated rights under the Act. This act is very important. This is a Supreme Court judgment in which it has been held that passing off is nothing but making an impression or say representing a business, like representing a business of showing that like he owns a business of somebody else, but this is not the true in passing off. Then we'll see the tabular differentiation type of remedy. The statutory remedy under section 29 clause 1 of the Trademark Act 1999, passing off is a common law remedy. Registration, it is a prerequisite, and passing off, it is not a requisite. So registration is a prerequisite in infringement, but in passing off, registration of trademark is not a prerequisite. Proof: plaintiff is only required to show deceptive similarity as there is presumption of confusion. So he has to only show that his trademark has been copied. It is actually deceptively similar to that of the defendant. But apart from proving deceptive similarity, the plaintiff is also required to prove confusion in public and the likelihood of injury to the plaintiff's goodwill. So he also has to show like his copying of the trademark has actually caused him a loss in his business and also goodwill of his business. Then jurisdiction: the registered proprietor or registered user of the trademark can institute the suit where they actually and voluntarily resides or carries his business or works for gain. gain. So these are the places in which jurisdiction is lying, and passing of jurisdiction is actually based on section 20 of the Civil Procedure Code. Then we'll come to international question number 10, the last question of this session. International treaties are agreements of a contractual character between states or organization of states, creating legal rights and obligations between the parties. Comment with illustrations. So you have to illustrate this statement, like what did he mean by international treaties and agreements, and which are creating legal rights and obligations between the parties. So let us start with the introduction. Article 38 Clause 1 of the International Court of Justice statute identifies treaties as a source of law. Along with general principles and custom, treaties occupy a very eminent position in international law. They ensure friendly and peaceful relations of states with one another and are a means by which international organizations take form, regulate and monitor their affairs. Drafted by the International Law Commission of the UN and taking force on 27 January 1980, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties set out some fundamental rules as to how treaties are to operate and take form. More than half of the members of the UN are party to the convention, so the treaty law are actually guided by this convention, which is known as the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, and which has been adopted in the year 1980. So this is a treaty which actually regulates the procedure and adoption of the treaties by international organizations, or between a state and the international organizations, or between the states. So let us see parties to treaty. So there are two types of parties to a treaty: state parties and third parties. A state party has ratified and signed the treaty and is legally bound to follow it, but a third state has been defined as a state which is not a party to the treaty. So let us see when third state is also responsible to the treaty. Article 34 of the convention says that a third state shall be free from any rights or obligations to a treaty. In case of treaties having a provision to extend obligations to a third state, such provision must have obtained the express consent of the third state. So treaty actually works with the consent of the state, and if a third party has consented to it, then it actually applies to them also. Then we will be dealing with drafted by the International Law Commission of the UN and taking force of the Vienna Convention set out. We have already dealt with it. Then we will be dealing with concept of treaty. So treaty in common parlance may be defined as written agreements between parties which may or may not be stated to identify and follow a set of rules. The ICJ has stated in the North Continental Shelf cases that some treaties may give rise to international conduct, customs, and be of a fundamental norm-creating character. Article 26 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaty deals with the maxim pacta sunt servanda, that is, every signatory is to follow the treaty in good faith and is binding upon them. So treaties, the adoption of the treaties is actually follows the maxim of pacta sunt servanda, which is treaty which is adopted in good faith and also is binding upon them. This forms the basis of every international agreement. Then kinds of treaty. So there are two kinds of treaty: bilateral treaty and multilateral treaty. Treaties involving two entities are bilateral treaties. It is not necessary that the treaty can only have two parties. There may be more than two parties. However, there should be only two states involved. So for example, the bilateral treaties between Switzerland and the European Union have 17 parties, which are divided into two parts, the Swiss and the EU. So the two treaties may not be only two states. There may be also an international organization, or a consortium of states, and also a single state. Then multilateral treaties between three countries or more are multilateral treaties. So the minimum condition is 3 or more, and in bilateral only 2. They might be international or domestic. They give rise to rights and obligations among all the parties. Each signatory has obligations towards all other signatories. Then the binding force of treaty is very important. Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties 1969. The International Law Commission of the United Nations drafted the Vienna Convention on the it is an international agreement between the states to govern and regulate treaties. So Article 26 of the treaty deals with enforceability of the treaty pacta sunt servanda. Every treaty in force is binding upon the parties to it and must be performed by them in good faith. So Article 26 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties provides for pacta sunt servanda and it actually provides for the binding force of the treaties, which says that it has to be performed in good faith. Very important article, remember this. Then how treaty is formed. The first is adoption of the text, then authentication of the text. So there are 8 steps involved in formation of treaty. First one is adoption of the text, second is authentication of the text, third one is expression of consent, fourth one is consent by signature, then consent by exchange of instruments required by the treaty. You must have seen in a news channel wherein the party authenticates and puts his signature and they exchange the instruments required by the treaty. Then sixth one is consent by ratification, acceptance or approval. Then seventh is consent expressed by accession. So consent can also be ratification, acceptance or approval, and it can also be accession and at formulation of reservations. So parties can also have reservations to certain rules. That means the party can also before the enforcement of the treaty can have certain reservations of not to enforce such rules which have been given in the treaty. Then invalidity of treaty. Part 5 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties 1969, Articles 46 to 53 sets out the ways to invalidate a treaty, make them void and unenforceable under international law. So invalidation is nothing but after the invalidation the treaty becomes void and unenforceable under international law. Then termination of treaty, how it is done by withdrawal. So obligations in international law arise from the consent of the state. This is why treaties are mostly non-binding in nature and they expressly allow a party to withdraw. So see, treaties, although it has a binding force under Article 26 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties, but still it acts upon the consent of the states. Once a state withdraws his consent, then a treaty have no force. Termination of treaty, then withdrawal. Obligations in international law arise from consent in this treaty. This is why treaties are mostly non-binding in nature and they expressly allow a party to withdraw. For example, single convention on narcotic drugs says that the treaty shall be terminated if the total number of signatories falls below 40. Article 56 deals with withdrawal from treaties without a termination, denunciation and withdrawal clause. So Article 56 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties 1969 allows for withdrawal. Then modes of suspension and termination, let us see. Implied by the conclusion of a later treaty. So if a later treaty is followed, then the earlier treaty can be suspended. Then as a consequence of its breach, if any breach happens, then impossibility of performance, if it becomes impossible to perform an obligation given under the treaty. Then fundamental change of circumstances, if there is a change of circumstances which actually makes the treaty void. Then rift of diplomatic or consular relations, this is very common. And then emergence of new just causes, then new preemptory laws. Then we'll come to conclusion. The Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties lays down basic and fundamental principles to govern treaties. The main principle on which the convention operates is pacta sunt servanda. All treaties must be followed in good faith. It provides for various provisions such as ratification, reservation, approval, conclusion, withdrawal, invalidation, termination of a treaty, etc. We have seen all this. The convention is legally binding on its parties. Treaties play an important role as the source of international law and occupy a colossal pedestal in this field. So see, the treaty is actually binding upon state if it is applied in good faith, if the party consents to it. Suppose if there is no consent, if there is any rift in diplomatic relation or any other change in circumstances, then the treaty have no force. So this is the end of the session. I hope you all have liked it. Kindly people give a thumbs up to this video and also like, share and subscribe to the channel. And we will be having only one session of subjective part where I will be discussing with you the subjective questions of Jamia Millia Islamia LLM Entrance Examination 2016. So in that session only 8 questions were asked and the total marks was only 40. 5 marks each for every question. So I will be discussing with that session tomorrow. And people also, many of you have requested me to supply the PDF. So let me tell you, soon we will be getting the PDF on sale, where you can purchase as it is. You can purchase the question paper along with its answers, and also the answers of the subjective questions which I have dealt with you. So do not worry, I will be notifying you like when you can purchase those products. So with this session, I am signing off. Have a great day.